Vaheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Vaheguru Ji Ki Fateh. Thank you for joining today's webinar hosted by the Sikh Research Institute. This webinar will begin with a 50-minute discussion, followed by 30 to 40 minutes for Q&A. So please drop your questions in the chat box and be sure to include your name and your city. Now I would like to introduce you to today's presenters. Harleen Kaur is a community organizer, educator, and scholar, a sociology PhD candidate at UCLA. She studies the intersection of racialization, collective trauma, and nationalism through the story of the Sikh diaspora and our quest for belonging. Much of Harleen's inspiration, voice, and vision was cultivated during her year as a Bonderman Fellow, when she backpacked solo through 15 countries to better develop a global framework for liberation and sovereignty. Dr. Jaspreet Bal is a professor and program coordinator in the Child and Youth Care program at Humber College in Toronto. Bal serves on the board of directors of the Sikh Feminist Research Institute and the national board of the World Sikh Organization. She's also the editor of the Relational Child and Youth Care Practice Journal, as well as the co-host of the podcast #AskCanadianSikhs. And lastly, today we have Paneet Singh. Paneet is a playwright and filmmaker whose work is largely inspired and informed by Sikh and South Asian culture and history. Outside of theater and film, his work is mostly based on history and education. He is a founding member of the South Asian Canadian Histories Association and a co-host of the Nameless Collective podcast, which follows histories of South Asians in British Columbia. Please welcome today's presenters. So it appears that Dr. Ball has been kicked out. I apologize for this inconvenience. Perhaps we could throw it to Harleen or Paneet to start off our conversation on definitions and understandings of Bhakti and Shakti. Harleen?
Vaheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Vaheguru Ji Ki Fateh. So yeah, I guess just to start, when I was asked, to participate in this conversation, I think I sort of reflected back to my upbringing in camp and, all of the different, I think, lessons about, for me, I often learned about this through the framework of Miri Piri. And I think we have a lot of different frameworks for the same concept in Sikhi, which I'm sure Paneet Singh can expand on as well. But I think to me, when I think about this idea of Shakti and Bhakti, Miri Piri, to me, it really comes down to this balance of, I think, the way I was taught was sort of this balance between investment in the material world, but doing that for the sake of our own journey as Sikhs. And so for me, it's really ensuring that whatever investment we're making in the world that we're in is for the sake of a response to that, which is in line with goodwill. And that, I think, is where the Bhakti comes in, sort of developing this understanding and creating a higher consciousness. And I think a lot of my understanding of Shakti is also force for the sake of attaining or experiencing Waheguru. And Bhakti is to sort of continuously remind ourselves that that is our purpose, and also the only true power is Akal Purakh. So sort of this this kind of balance that is continuously happening. A text that I reference a lot in Sikhi conversations is Pedagogy of the Oppressed by Freire. And he also has this concept called praxis, which I was reflecting on again. And just to quote from him, he says, within the word, he calls it the true word, which I think is also interesting, we find two dimensions, reflection and action, in such radical interaction that if one is sacrificed, even in part, the other immediately suffers. So I sort of see the same kind of continuous interaction happening between Shakti and Bhakti as well.
Okay. Can you hear me?
Oh, do you want to just throw right over to me? I wasn't sure if Jesse wanted to say anything or not.
Thank you for picking that up. And same question, take it away. Yeah, same reflections, thoughts on the title of the topic.
Yeah, Waheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Waheguru Ji Ki Fateh. I wasn't planning on saying Fateh, but Harleen Kaur did, so now I feel like I have to be a good Sikh. It's a brilliant and succinct and eloquent answer from Harleen Kaur. For myself, I think like ditto on a lot of the stuff that Benji said, but also, and I can point back towards my upbringing as well. A lot of going to camps was a big part of it. But a big part of my upbringing was also Shastra Vidya, is learning Gatka. And my Ustad, Bhai Charanjit Singh, the late Bhai Charanjit Singh, was very insistent on the fact that Gatka, Shastra Vidya, was not exclusively a martial practice, but a spiritual practice. And also insistent on that as we vichar or go through this world, that we should carry ourselves with that kind of poise as a warrior. And that kind of being ingrained into my psyche in my early teens really formed a lot of how I approached my community practice, my spiritual practice, my simran, my seva, all of it. And I think when we look towards like Sikh, like our ethos as a Panth, I think the thing that makes it unique, I think, is kind of inherent in this idea, is inherent in this idea of Miri Piri and kind of the first ceremony when we look towards just kind of like how radical it was that Guru Hargobind Sahib Maharaj took a symbol of war, and often like when we call back to it, it's like a common rhetorical device from like pracharaks and kathavachiks. It'll be like ek hath chamala, ek hath kirpan. But the thing that's so rad about Guru Hargobind Sahib Maharaj is that it wasn't ek hath chamala, ek hath kirpan. It was kirpan in both hands. So our bhakti is inherently combative, and our activism, our warrior spirit is inherently devotional. And I think that's something that when we look at a lot of these words like Miri Piri, Sant Sipahi, Bhakti Shakti, there's like we hyphenate them in our use of the language often, but even when we're referring to them colloquially, we don't say Bhakti Te Shakti, because like it's this one idea made of two parts. So yeah, echoing a lot of what Harleen Kaur said, but for me it always comes down to the fact that the two qualities are belong to and inherent to one another.
That's so beautiful. Thank you. And let's talk about these words and these terms a little bit. So we titled this webinar Shakti Bhakti, and I know some of those synonyms came out while you all were talking. So like we talked about Miri Piri, Deg, Raj, Jog. What is the significance to these different terms? What do they evoke in you? Where do you hear which ones used? And do you see them as synonyms? And Harleen Kaur, we'll start with you.
Sure. I think beyond what I already said, I'm thinking about the framework of Deg now. I think something that we maybe didn't talk about as much is also the importance of seva in manifesting these concepts in ourselves, right? So I think Deg most often gets associated with the seva, but again, I think as I was reflecting through these, it's as Paneet Singh so beautifully shared, it's how much of it is our sort of Western understanding recreating a binary between these two things, when I don't think that's what Guru Sahib intended, right? I mean, so much of Bani is telling us that we shouldn't live in duality. So how is it possible that this concept so innate to Sikhi and our practice of it could be a duality, right? It doesn't click logically for me. So so even, for example, to answer your question more directly, I think they are sort of synonyms or different concepts that have different context to them, but I think they're sort of describing a similar practice or embodiment from different contexts. And I think that looking at Deg, we need to figure out, how do we see seva? How do we see the practice of seva in both? So Deg, Langar seva is seva, right? But also the practice of Deg as seva. And what is when we're engaging in practice of Deg or Shakti or all of those things, Miri, how are we doing that as a practice of seva so that the ego doesn't get in the way in terms of how we're acting?
Absolutely. Paneet Singh?
Yeah, in terms of like the specific terminology, I think specific terms in like are evocative of like certain applications. So like when I think Deg, for me, it's very much a community type of outlook. It's like, I don't like, when I think about my own spiritual practice, it's not it's not Deg. Like for yourself, you think more along, or I think more along the lines of Miri Piri, and they're kind of or Sant Sipahi. I think that's kind of like the descendant of that, where it becomes very personal, where the Deg becomes very much about community. Raj Jog for me often has like the connotation of like politics. So I think they are synonymous to an extent, but the specificity, I think, is also very it's very nuanced in kind of our use of it. But I feel like they are all evocative of the same kind of idea. And Harleen Kaur used this concept of duality and oneness like really poignantly, and I agree very much that I think it is all evocative of that same concept. But and then in terminology, I think the nuance of it, as someone who's probably a better Punjabi speaker than me, would be more in tune with it. But that's where my mind goes.
Yeah, I think I have. We all have our associations and our histories with those terms, and like Miri Piri de Malik, when I think about Guru Har Gobind Maharaj, it always hits me in a really different way, and I'm really moved by that. And I think you touched on this a little bit, that they are, both of you talked about this, that they're not things that we see as binary or as mutually exclusive in Sikhi. So what are some places where do you get evidence for the fact that they're not mutually exclusive? That they're not either or, you have to pick a team, or that you do your bhakti between 9 to 5, and then from 5 to 7 you do your shakti, and then you go back. What are examples? And maybe we'll go the other way this time. We'll start with Paneet Singh. What are some examples from Sikhi where you've seen the overlap or the concept?
So there's a really specific Sakhi that for me comes to mind. I don't want to get too prachar on you, but just very quickly. And it's interesting. But the reason that it comes to mind is because it has nothing to do with battle. But it was this incredible Sakhi from Gyani Pinderpal Singh, where it was a Sikh during the time of Guru Arjan Dev Ji. And he used to be a Brahmin Pandit, I believe, and was like guilty of like tons of caste discrimination, came to Guru's Darbar, changed his life. And he's like, I can't believe I've been doing this my whole life. Devoted himself to Guru Arjan Dev Ji Maharaj's life. I might have the Guru Sahib wrong, I apologize. And then he started doing seva in the langar, which was radical for him, now doing seva of people of all stripes. And then, but the other langar sevadars never used to see him eat. And then one day, I think the head langari saw that after the sangat had gone home and everything was done, he used to go around and he used to pick up the rice and the roti and dal that was on the ground, and he used to eat that, and he used to like curse at himself and swear at himself for the life that he had led up to that point. And then the Sikh told Guru Arjan Dev Ji Maharaj called him and said that, well, like this is not what langar is, that your place in langar is alongside everybody else. And so that's where I want like you to eat. And then it continued. And even though Maharaj had given him that instruction, he continued to not feel confident enough or brave enough or belonging enough to sit with the rest of the Sangat. And so the Sevadar saw him again, continuing with the same, like swearing at himself, cursing himself. And what happened is when they took him back to Maharaj, then Maharaj gave him the understanding that it was, that they said that there's nimrata and then there's hinta. And the nimrata being humility, and hinta is like considering yourself less than everybody else. And they said when you deny yourself, like being on the plane of everybody else, when you go to the place of hinta, that you're denying the existence of the divine within yourself. And Guru Arjan Dev Ji Maharaj said that you're my Sikh and I reside within you. If you're not feeding yourself prashadda, that means you're denying me prashadda. And the reason, which I thought was incredible and beautiful and powerful, and for me, this is the application of Bhakti and Shakti. This is the application of Sant Sipahi. I remember I did this exercise once where I was talking about the same concept, because I love this concept, with a couple of SSAs here. And what we did is we made 2 columns of like what are the qualities of a saint and what are the qualities of a soldier. And after we did that on a whiteboard, we erased the titles and we swapped them. Because our bhakti is so combative. It's like we go to battle with Kam, Krodh, Lomo, Hankar every day. That's what a warrior does. And a saint is the person who loses the battle every single day and gets up the next day to fight again. And that's, for me, like the two belong to each other. And that's, I feel like it's that Sakhi of that Gursikh often comes to mind, is because when we abandon this like idea of self and belonging as an individual, as a part of this bant, we usually think of it, or we can think of it as this kind of like, no, I'm doing what the Guru is asking of me. I'm being low. I'm following the teachings of Asadi. But really, it's like there's it's more than just your actions themselves. It's the consciousness behind the actions as well.
It's beautiful. Thank you. Harleen, same question. Where do you see examples of this in Sikhi?
Yeah, I think just briefly, because we've already been referencing Guru Har Gobind Sahib, but I think for me, the Sakhi that I always loved as a kid, but I think now as I've learned more about prison abolition really speaks to me, is Bandi Chhod Divas. So, common Sakhi, so I won't go on too long, but I think just, even if we look at this example again, as Paneet Singh said, not like a battle, like a battle on the field example, but again, this was a case in which Guru Sahib was doing bot with the Hindu Rajas inside. There was the bot that is happening by the Sangat outside, so long as Guru Sahib and these, princes were still in prison. And Guru Sahib was able to use, sort of what we maybe term as like worldly power, the power of negotiation, to improve the prison conditions so long as they were stuck there, and also negotiate for their release, right? And did that through, I'm intentionally sort of using more like current modern day organizing strategies so we can see the connections here, but like what we would now say like as collective action, right? Like Sant Mia Mir came and negotiated with Wazir Khan to like use his power, right? So it was sort of this like collaborative effort across the Sangat and Guru Sahib to really make sure that these people got free, and until they got free, that their conditions were at least on as human of a level as you can have in prison, right? And so I think what's really important there is, as they were doing that, there was continuous thought, there was continuous recitation of Gurbani, and that's what was grounding them in their action. So I think even from Guru Har Gobind Sahib, who really grounded us in Shastra Vidya, there are so many other beautiful examples of that that are demonstrating that in different ways too.
That's so beautiful. And the Gurus were revolutionary in their thinking and what they did years ago. I always find it interesting when like new language comes up, that we can used to describe that. And that is the first time I've heard that Sakhi talked about a reference as prison abolition. And my brain's like, it's going places. I like it. Not that prison abolition is a new concept. There are years of hard work that Black activists have and other people have put into. It's just newer in our everyday vocabulary right now. Yeah, so there, and there's so many really great examples where I think about how when the Gurus built cities, when they designed Darbar Sahib, the way Akal Takht is in front of Harmandir Sahib, the way a Diwan Hall is designed, the way we put Shastra in front of our Guru, all of these things that just drive home that it's not one and then the other. And I think sometimes outside of my Sikh spheres, I really do get, well, no, only people who are angry are turned to arms, or, if you were really able to change your perspective and accept the world, then you wouldn't feel this way, and you wouldn't have Shastra, and you wouldn't have, and I like that we can advocate for abolition of systems like prisons, and at the same time hold our resolve in being people who are armed and not see that as two ideas that are conflicting. So Paneet, kind of to this list that you were talking about, the one that you made, sometimes we look at qualities of being a Sant Sipahi as being masculine and feminine, and the obvious ones being that the Bhakti side have a little bit more feminine qualities and the Shakti side tends to have masculine qualities. And at the same time, we're having conversations about gender as not being binary. We're talking about these things as not being a dichotomy. What are your ideas of where gender falls into each? Do you assign a gender to either side? And what does that, where do those ideas come from?
Well, as a cis hetero Singh, I think I have the best opinions on this. I'm sure I do. I have the most important opinions, I should say, about this. That's a joke, in case anyone's going to have my head on a platter for that. It's interesting, and I was having a conversation with a friend of mine who I think is an incredible Sikh in the way he lives his life, and he's also a counselor. And we kind of grew up similarly. We're undersized guys, so we got picked on when we were either overtly or covertly when you're growing up. You hear the idiomatic expressions of banda ban ja a lot, that kind of stuff growing up. And we talked about this a lot. Where sorry, there was a beep in the back. I hope it wasn't too alarming. But we talked about this a lot, where we're mobilized, we're trying to ingrain patriarchal kind of mindsets in our Singhs, because it's well, Baba Deep Singh, that's the extent of our analysis, and it's really kind of sad. I mean, how much does Gurbani point towards? Does Guru Gobind Singh Ji Maharaj? My favorite thing from the colonial scholar. I'm sorry, the tech in my house is going nuts. My phone just went off. But Ernest Trump, the German dude who went to India and tried to tell everyone what Sikh he was, he said one thing that I love, and I quote, because I think he meant it in a completely different way, and I took it in a different way. He said the first 9 gurus talked about pretty much the same thing, but the 10th guru, he was obsessed with this goddess. And I think he was just completely obsessed, because, I mean, Guru Gobind Singh Ji Maharaj was, I would say, in the most positive connotations, the divine feminine energy of battle was Chandi. And I think that's incredible. And how much do we understate that? When we're teaching Sikhi, is one of the most horrific things. I mean, the qualities of Bhakti and Shakti are given to us usually in the form of the feminine. In the forms of Sohagan, often tied with Bhakti, and then on the battlefield in the forms of Chandi. And it's and we're trying to apply these kind of like bravado, like Punjabi Jat much into a tapi and like, you know, singular museala, and like conflate that to our warrior ethos as a panth. And I think that's like, it's one of the most horrific things. And I'm definitely guilty of it myself. And I'm sure it's been ingrained throughout history. But like at the root of it, it's wild to me that we've managed to do this.
Yeah, for sure. Harleen, Kaur, same thing. So do you assign a gender to either concept, and where do those ideas come from?
Yeah, I mean, I think pretty similar to sorry, I'm hearing an echo. Okay, might be better now. I think pretty similar to what Paneet Singh already said. You know, definitely sort of an amalgamation of US and Punjabi gender norms. But I think something that it's interesting. I'm thinking about your response a lot because there's this lecture or workshop that Bhakti Singh did at Toronto Singh's camp. I don't know how many years back. My brother just pointed me to it. And he actually, the whole workshop is about addressing GOM specifically for, and I'll, you know, give the caveat that it's very much towards like cis het Singhs, but he actually uses Chandi Divad as an example of, you know, as Singhs, we have as a, you know, I think as a panth, like we have created this image of both Waheguru and Guru Sahib being like a sort of in either Punjabi or Western context, like a man, right? And so and very like masculine ideas. And so I would assume for men, what that does is that creates a type of power dynamic where you see yourself as closer to that end goal, right? And sort of prevents you from seeing what growth needs to happen. And so Sitpal Singh sort of shares, like, you know, connecting through Waheguru through Chandi Divad and the recitation of that as a way to connect with, you know, the feminine divine. And then for me, speaking as, you know, a cis woman and a God, I think on the flip side of that, the conversations I've had and why Sitpal Singh's lecture was so interesting to me is because I've had a lot of conversations in God-only spaces where it's this idea of feeling prevented from building a relationship with Guru Sahib because of these gendered constructs that we bought into as Sikhs. And because we, yeah, it's sort of, if you're placing that same sort of male construct, it is preventing a relationship or creating a dissonance with Guru Sahib and Waheguru as well. So I think for me, that's something to continue working through. And one thing that I'm thinking about is, you know, obviously we're still using these ideas of like feminine and masculine energy, even when trying not to buy into gender. So is there a way to like have this conversation fully removed from like those gendered constructs, but also recognizing that there's sort of this history of talking about it as like feminine and masculine energy. So that's something that I definitely am still like working through and processing through. And I think it's just an ongoing process of really connecting with Guru Sahib and Gurbani and being able to have more like decolonial understandings of Gurbani and all of that. Looks like we lost Dr. Bella again.
Did we lose Jaspreet Kaur again?
It looks like it.
Yes, it looks like Just Breathe has been kicked out, but yes, perhaps Paneet Singh, you'd like to elaborate a little on that same question. I know you addressed it, but anything while we wait for Just Breathe.
Well, also, Paneet, I don't know if you want to, maybe it sounds like we're already heading in the direction of our next segment, which is more so thinking about how these
I'm back.
Sort of stereotypes or I don't know what to call them, but yeah, I guess like these constructs have sort of manifested in the diaspora and thinking about that through our work.
Can you hear me now? I can hear you. Okay, perfect. But I like that. If you want to continue with that.
Sounds great.
Yeah, sorry, I heard the first half of the question, and then just before came back and it distracted me because would you mind repeating it? Because I didn't get the second half.
I'll let our moderator go for it.
All right, I'll get right back in there. Yeah, so you've both pursued through history, art, and academia the complicated process of Sikh identity formation in the diaspora. So I'm going to put you a little bit on the spot because you're both subject matter experts and there's a reason you were brought here, and you've done really cool and innovative things in arts and academia and looked at history in through a lens that we haven't had a chance to see before. I actually think a way that our generation has the luxury of telling our own story, the privilege of telling our own story in a way that has very much been done for us in the past. So can you share just a few highlights of the work that you have done? And we'll start with Paneet.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think what underscores a lot of my work is that same Sakhi. I think about it a lot. Is like understanding this importance of like as a marginalized or made like a marginalized community in the spaces that we live. Is centralizing our stories is so important, and claiming that space is important with confidence is important, and the humble everyday stories of our homes are important. And that drives a lot of the work I do, and then still kind of maintaining that understanding of a common understanding of humility through a Gurmat lens, and like making sure that is also weaved into it. So like that's kind of where my work lives, for me, the thing that kind of drives a lot of my work is that through my film and theater work, it's an opportunity for me to engage with the stories of our community and elders in a way that it usually allows me to put my political spin on it to a certain extent, and then but also like just honors the fact, just honors their very existence, which I think which like to come from a migrant community and to live through like the multiculturalism politics of the 1970s, often like pitted like this wider community against you. And if you didn't understand that, or if you didn't carry those qualities of Bhakti and Shakti, of confidence and humility, then we wouldn't have had like the rad community organizing that we had throughout the last decades. We wouldn't be having conversations in our circles about prison abolition and about abolishing or defunding the police in our circles if those traditions weren't coming over the last decades. And so yeah, it's an opportunity for me to take things like and also for me is to bring the community together in a space where it's okay to talk about what you've experienced, and it's valid just because you experienced it. I think oftentimes that's not afforded to large demographic, like large segments of our Pant in most of the spaces that we do. And one of the shows that I wrote, a Vancouver Guldasta, which was about a Sikh Punjabi family in Vancouver living through the experience of Operation Blue Star over the first 10 days of June. Every show was followed by a talkback so that the community would have a chance to just share their stories. And it wasn't exclusively a Punjabi Sikh audience. It was probably like a 30% Punjabi Sikh audience turnout. But how much space the community felt that they could claim because of the story that they just watched was quite amazing. And also the amount of aunties that I saw stand up and share their stories, and say for the first time that I've never spoken, and like their husbands are sitting there like looking at them like, hey, like what? And it's like this is exactly what we need. It's like we need spaces where like people feel emboldened to speak their experience and their truth, because for too long they've been marginalized. So it's just like a place for amplification, really. I just went on like a random long rant, so I'll just
awesome.
weirdly tie it off there.
Okay, Harleen, Kaur. Yeah. So, what are some of the places in your work and some examples of the stuff that you've done that have brought you to this point?
Yeah, I think Paneet Singh does really beautiful sort of like uncovering work through arts and things like that. And I think I would characterize what I do more as untangling. So I sort of my dissertation that I'm working on right now really studies what I kind of see as what I do see working on that. What I do see as the legacies of colonization as we embody them as Sikhs in the U.S., Canada, and the UK. And some of the ways that I think we see this, and I know we'll get into this later as it relates to Bhakti and Shakti, but specifically our investment in the nation state over sort of Sikh structures of sovereignty. And I think another important point to that, which Paneet Singh brought up, is this ongoing legacy of collective trauma that we have as a community that is very unaddressed. Very much in terms of obviously gender-based violence and things like that. And I also think what I focus on more so is race. So specifically racialized trauma and how that really, and specifically how Sikhs were racialized by the British, which then allowed Sikhs to sort of be used in support of the nation state instead of resistance, which I think was more so our history was one of resistance rather than buying into the state. And I think for me, I mean, just to take it on a more personal narrative, because I think a lot of times I want to be candid about this because I think academia is something I never saw myself going into growing up. I didn't even really think about a PhD actually until I finished undergrad. And so just to sort of be candid about like what that process was for me, because there aren't a lot of Sikhs who go down this route. I think, yeah, it was just things in my life that started to come up and sort of untangle or unravel the narratives I'd been told. So I grew up in Wisconsin in the Oak Creek Sanghat. And so obviously for me, the 2012 shooting at the Gurdwara was a really big awakening point of, yeah, maybe this thing I've been told that if I, explain my identity the right way, and if I'm like friendly enough to people and things like that, they'll love us enough for us to belong. Like, I think that was a really big waking up point of like, maybe this is not really the legitimate approach to being Sikhs in the diaspora. And I think just the timing of that for me, that happened my first year of undergrad. And then within a few months was also the killing of Trayvon Martin by George Zimmerman, as well as George Zimmerman's acquittal. And so for me, I think it was really this whole unraveling of buying into the US as our protector, that of course, as immigrants, like we've had to buy into, because why would you go somewhere if you don't think it's better than where you're coming from? And so, and then, the fellowship that was mentioned in my bio as well, allowing me to really make global connections of this is not just something that Sikhs have gone through. And it's also, at the same time, Sikhs have also participated in making it worse for other communities, especially through what I'm writing on right now is really our imperial legacies, the way that Sikhs were shipped off to other nations to help the British steal that land from the indigenous people, right? So I think sort of this long journey of figuring out, I think we're really good to some extent of knowing our selective history and our Sikh history, but as a community, we really don't understand the histories of the lands that we came to, the lands that we now live on, the places that we have helped sort of take over. I think that sort of just building a more diasporic understanding of what is our Sikh legacy and how do we come to terms with that and reckon with that today.
And let's keep going with that. So I think that our Bhakti and our Shakti and our ability to knit those into who we are and into our practice is our biggest strength. And then sometimes it is exploited by colonizers, by militarized states to do their own work. And this is always one of those issues. And I applaud that you're diving in and doing the work of untangling this, because this is when it comes to the use or misuse of Bhakti and Shakti, I always just end up in a place where it's agree to disagree. Because I see a celebration of veterans, and I can see both sides of that. And I see, Sikh civil liberties organizations fighting for the right to wear this thought and serve in the US military. And I can understand why some people would celebrate that. We have a very strong heritage. And when we come and we brought all of that into the diaspora with us, what does living that Bhakti Shakti look like in the diaspora? So in terms of the work you're doing, doing the deep dive into military service, police service, the people that resist these ideas, the people that lean into these ideas, both sides inform their opinions with Barney and history. So how are you looking at that?
This is to me still, right?
Pardon?
To me still?
Yeah, to you.
Okay.
This is your turning to your subject matter expertise.
Sounds good. So so I'll focus on the military component, just because I think that's sort of where I already started going. For me and my understanding, I think the biggest struggle that I see in terms of the way that Sikh identity gets tied into the military narrative today is that there isn't a distinction between sort of Sikh Guru Sahib's concept of Miri Piri and how that got warped or transformed through British colonization. And I think that's intentional. That's not to say we're doing that to sort of dishonor our history or anything like that. I think that is that was the whole point of colonization, was to tell our story for us, as Paneet Singh said. So, I guess a quick example, like as I'm looking back through these documents of the British first coming to Punjab, them first sort of taking over what was, the Northwest province at that time, what they termed it. There are so many documents of them trying to understand. And I think even like a more colloquial example is McAuliffe and like his whole research. There were so many efforts for the British to really discern and define Sikh identity for themselves. And we have to really question ourselves and ask, like, why have we given them so much credit of saying like, oh, this is because they were interested in Sikhi, or they thought it was cool, they wanted to be our friends? No, it was because they needed to conquer the land for them to have power. And the only way for them to do that was to understand how we operated and translate it into their own frameworks. And so looking at these old documents of the British deciding this type of shastra is legal for this person, this kind of person can make this shastra, like totally like illogical frameworks that don't make any sense. And that's sort of the way that they started to deconstruct our own sense of identity, was putting it in their legal frameworks. And we see like the legacies of that today in so many ways. But I think that's the most dangerous thing to me, is that the British were successfully able to take our idea of resistance and make us feel that fighting for a military, fighting for a state, imperial effort was the same thing as Miri Piri. And I will be the first to admit that I don't know nearly enough Sikh history, but again, from my understanding, that was never Guru Sahib's intention. This is why throughout Sikh history, Guru Sahib made their own institutions. We created new Gurmat institutions because nothing in the world was doing that for us. And so for us to now look at, Guru Har Gobind Sahib's legacy, Guru Sahib's legacy, and say that is the same as serving for a nation state, which their intentions are simply not the same, right? The nation state's military is to defend the people within the nation and do that at whatever cost necessary. Whereas Bhakti Shakti, Guru Sahib's legacy of Miri Piri, is to embody Ikkonkar, is to do seva. And to me, there's really no element of doing seva through military service as we see it today. So I think that's the biggest struggle that is really going to take a long time to deconstruct. And I think the biggest reason is because as Sikhs, we're both under and miseducated on these legacies, as well as like the legacies of the institutions we're committing to. So I think just to tie it more to today, this whole conversation about police abolition, which in the mainstream is more being talked about defunding the police. I think this is, as Sikhs, we just don't, tying back to my earlier point of, we don't just understand the legacies of the countries that we're belonging to. So I think I didn't learn until much later in life that the police in the US were the original police in the US were slave patrols who were in charge of bringing enslaved Africans back to the plantation after they had escaped. And so when you have that legacy of an institution, what protection can it really provide to all people? So I think as Sikhs, we really need to bring it upon ourselves to re-educate ourselves and unlearn these things. And I'm always reminded of this quote by Asada Shakur, and she said, no one is going to give you the education you need to overthrow them. Nobody is going to teach you your true history, teach you your true heroes, if they know that knowledge will help set you free. And I think that's, Paneet, that's why your work is so important too. And I think as Sikhs, the beauty is like, we actually do have the knowledge that will set us free. It's Gurbani, right? It's Guru Sahib's legacy. So I think figuring out how do we uncover those narratives like you're doing and sort of, yeah, bring them back to their more authentic history, which I'm sure you can talk about more.
I mean, you're an absolute gangster. I love it. The work that you're doing, I think, is so important. And like, I was nodding throughout the whole thing. But there is this weird conflation, and I do think it's really weird. And it's ingrained because of colonization about like military service and like in seva and like working and like working for imperial power, and like that's all the same. I mean, I've like military historians will sometimes, like Sikh military historians will sometimes say like, I can't see a difference between the shaheeds of their language, the shaheeds of the armies in the world wars, and the shaheeds of Guru Har Gobind Sahib's Akal Sena. And like, I have like a visceral reaction to that, because how we ended up in both positions is very different. I'm not going to pretend like that like all of Sikh military history, even like Sikh Raj time, even Sikh missile time, agrees with my politics. I can't do that. But like in terms of the value system that informs my politics, or like that informed theirs, I can look towards that. Kind of like what you were saying. Well, I think one thing that gets overlooked a lot is there's so Anita Anand, who wrote The Patient Assassin, and Shahid Udham Singh biography. She writes in there about how I don't know if it was O'Dwyer or Dyer, but during the early 20th century, is that the way that they would get people to sign up for the army was pitting them against one another based on their religious, cultural, socioeconomic, caste identities. They would go to Punjab and be like, you know, the Marathas have given us 5,000, but you're supposed to be the warriors of Guru Gobind Singh. And so if you're the warriors of Guru Gobind Singh, the Marathas give us 5,000, and in all of Amritsar, we've gotten 2,500 employees. What does that say about you? And so like this horrible kind of mobilizing of or weaponizing of identity and like, I guess, militaristic or martial ethos is like really horrific, and it's become really ingrained over the last few hundred years. And I always turn to often, because I'm obsessed with it, is the early West Coast Ghadar history, which was fiercely anti-military. A lot of the activism was born out of the fact that a lot of these migrants were former British servants,
Right.
for want of a better word, but that they served in military and police, and they lived in places like Shanghai and Hong Kong, and they reaped privileges of that were afforded to them through colonization. But the thing that woke them up to it was also colonization. And like, you see that in Vancouver in a big way when, like, 1910, there's a bonfire in the streets of Vancouver where Jathedar Bhag Singh, the president of Khalsa Diwan Society, leads burning of medals and uniforms and certificates and honors from the military. There's directives issued from the Khalsa Diwan Society Vancouver that those who associate with the society can't wear their military uniforms in public anymore, or they won't be associated with the Gurdwara. We see it also when King what's-his-name came to Vancouver, and then the city asked the Sikhs of the Gurdwara that used to serve in the military to come in their military regalia and stand on stage and greet the King of England. Again, trying to mobilize the identity and the relationship to the advantage of white Canada. So it's like where is our agency in those conversations, and where are our ethos being exploited, like kind of like where the question leads, to oppress other communities and to marginalize other groups. It's something that I think we haven't interrogated enough, and like even when we begin to interrogate it, it's an easy kind of out to just go World War I, World War II. You end up on the right side of history in a broad stroke. It's like, okay, sure, you're not a Nazi. Okay, good starting point. But it's like, where do you go from there, right? It's like not being a Nazi. I mean, in today's, it's like, I mean, in the unfortunate state of today's world, is not the worst place to start. But I mean, it's not where our gurus, I feel, would want us starting from. It's like, hey, I mean, when I think Jo Satgur ka Gur Sikh Khave so palki uthar naam te aave, I was like, that's a high ideal of meditation, of devotional practice. To call yourself a Sikh and meditate on Akal Purkh's name, I would hate to think that we can start conflating that with, hey, don't be a Nazi. Like that's a pretty low bar to set. But I'm wondering, is Jaspreet Kaur back in?
I think she is. I was just going to say really quickly, I think one way to do that, because I think sometimes it's like thinking about like, how do we, thinking about like, how do we actually do that? And how do we actually like discern what is more like worldly frameworks versus Gurmat? And I think for me, like, even just like sort of alarm bells went off in my head when you said, like, if we think about like literally the common term for those roles was civil service, right? So even this idea of like, at that point, who are you serving now instead of Guru Sahib, right? Like the Sikhs, our intention should always be to serve Guru Sahib, to do seva of the embodiment of Akal Purkh, right? So if we're now like a civil servant, then like where are our intentions lying? And I think even, I mean, in my own reflection, I've been thinking about like, how do we actually like do that? How do we engage with that reflection process? And I've been thinking about Sid Gosht a lot lately. And funny enough, we actually got it as our hukum at home this morning before this. So I think just thinking of, again, like looking to Guru Sahib and thinking about like, what can we learn from Guru Sahib's journey through like the world and like existing worldly structures, and how they were able to assert Gurmat and like question Manmat in just like a day-to-day basis. And I think at the end of the day, like, obviously we're not going to know until we get there, but I mean, the Sakhi, just going back to the Sakhi you shared at the beginning, that was so beautiful, of in every instance, just asking ourselves, like, is this bringing us closer to embodying Ikonkar? Is this getting me closer to both seeing Rab in myself, but also in every other person, right? And so if there's anything that we're embodying that feels like it's separating ourselves from that, is that truly our best practice of Gurmat?
Thank you so much for that. And thank you for, can you turn your sound off on this? Yeah, we just had to do a little bit of a location swap so that we could get everything back on track. Thank you everyone for your patience. We got one more question before we open it up to, I can see that there are folks that are reacting. It's getting people thinking, and there's some questions. So please drop your questions in the Q&A, and we'll take questions there. The last big question I have for the presenters, and it is a big one, and it is a relevant one, is about the misappropriation of the terms Shakti and Bhakti. So we are living in a time where we've already talked about, how we do lean on narratives of Shakti to justify doing or not doing things in the diaspora. One of the things that I've found really alarming, and I think finally we're starting to have conversations about, is misappropriations of Bhakti and how they protect people in our Sangat. So we do have a lot of times where we will protect people who are perpetrators of sexual violence, people who hurt children, people who hurt Sangat, and a lot of protection is afforded to them because of this idea that they have somehow some divine connection, or look at how much Bhakti they have, and they can't be bad if they do those things. So the really big question of how can these terms be misappropriated to protect those, and how do we have these conversations that are not straightforward? And I think since Harleen, you started with the last one, we'll go to Paneet.
And then we'll go over to you.
I'm so glad that you put this in here, because I think this is such a incredibly important thing to be talking about. And people love to say in this day and age, but we've needed this for decades in a big way, because of the fact that, we've been doing throughout, Turtle Island, we've been doing overnight camps for Sikhs for 30 years, and based off little other than goodwill of the Panth, right? You just trusted because it's a Sikh space. But there are so many accounts of sexual violence, or there's this assured safety because of kind of performatively conservative ideals, in the forefront of oh, we keep the gender separate so it'll be fine, that kind of stuff. It enables us to just it's enabled us to turn a blind eye to it. And this, I think it's so horrific and counterintuitive to Gurmat ideals. That bhakti is a hall pass to do whatever you want to the people around you and harm the people around you, and be a criminal. I don't understand it. If we look at like Saveye, we read them every morning, or perhaps some of us do, and people love the line Sach ko honsole ho sabajin prem ki utan hi prapayo. But the first line of that party is kahan pe jo do lochan mund ke baith rahe ho bhaktiyan lagayo. Why? What is the point if you're full of pakhand to sit there with your eyes closed and literally do performative bhakti, right? Our language might be contemporary, but it's the exact same comment Guru Gobind Singh Ji Maharaj is talking about. And pakhand this is how much content of pakhand that Guru Gobind Singh Ji Maharaj is doing. And it's now leave pakhand behind, and now let's go to violence and harm. And how much further along there are we on that, how much gravitas of horrificness does that hold? So we enable it, and I think we enable it through our institutions. And I say that this is somebody who's grown up, and I love and value how much traditional vidya that I've been able to access, in terms of sampradaic learning styles. And I think that is a huge part of my spiritual outlook, and I wouldn't change that for the world. The information that I got, or the relationship that I had with my ustads. But I say that from a position of incredible privilege, that I usually didn't have to worry about my body being at risk in the spaces that I was in, by virtue of the environments that I grew up in learning. Because I think something we don't talk about enough is young Singhs being targeted often by predatory granthis and gyanis and that kind of thing, or so-called gyanis. And I think that we need our systems need to face their reckoning when we let these people be protected by committees, and when those committees are uncles, and when those uncles are the same ones who've been protecting each other from this kind of persecution or accountability. Where are we ever going to get? And I do have an affinity towards the Gurdwara committee because what it means, or the place that it held in when we started the formation of identity and community here in the West Coast through Khalsa Diwan Society. And it was something that's not what it is today. But as long as these systems are in place, and we're allowing, I don't see a way out of this. If we're not, there's people to say that, well, we can't do a criminal background check on someone coming from India. Fair enough, yeah, but the police isn't the only way to access information. You can find out from 7 different families if you have a potential rishta coming from India, what that person is like, right? I mean, like, we have our own systems in place informally. Is that you can find out about how legitimate a person is coming from there. So like safety measures are, I feel like, are incredibly important. And at the very least, accountability, like getting people out of these places is incredibly important. And just understanding that because someone is saying Waheguru, Waheguru, and carries a certain amount of knowledge about a subject, it doesn't give them a hall pass or excuse them. It in fact makes what they're doing so much worse, because they're not just, they're not just committing like horrific harm to another human being, but they are also taking the sanctity of Guru's Darbar and Gurbani away from that person. They're now associating that with trauma. They're associating that with harm and violence. And the fact that we're letting people get away with it is not so. It's like, so they can teach so many more people because they have so much more expertise. But we're putting those same people at the same positions of risk. And I have lots to say about this, but I'll leave it there.
Thank you so much. Harleen, Kaur, same big question. So how is the concept of bhakti misappropriated to protect those who produce violence in Sangha?
Yeah, I think Paneet Singh covered most of it. I think I'll just share maybe two things that I'm thinking about. One, I think I'll just share, if it's helpful for anyone, that the sort of Gurbani reference I hear most often with this conversation is, and I think exactly what Paneet Singh was talking about, is Jio Male Baron Nimble, right? So from Anand Sahib, this idea of, again, like, we can't be fooled by sort of what a person might be displaying. And at the end of the day, the only person who can really judge what's, what their true intentions are is Guru Sahib. So, and again, just for myself, also trying to reflect on, like, okay, what does that actually mean in terms of more tangibly, protecting people who are more vulnerable within the community and actually putting things into practice. I'm actually starting to think about now something, an intention that my mom very much raised us with, that I'm very thankful for. And she always was very adamant that she would very much always share with us that every Sikh should be able to be a Baisab, right? And in that saying, where every Sikh should be able to be a Granthi, right? Sort of using more neutral terminology, that as I've been reflecting on this in recent weeks or months, I'm also questioning how much of this is because of the way we have set up our community to really rely on particular people. And because of that very strong reliance, we can't have honest conversations about holding that person accountable. Because what does that mean if that person, the person that we have chosen, the person that we've now put up on this pedestal, is our ether or our connection point to Guru Sahib, is actually not as connected as we thought, right? Or is actually not as true of an embodiment as we thought. And I think that's sort of been my reflection lately of, like, why is it so hard for us to have these conversations around accountability? Why does it still, even in my generation, continue to devolve into this sort of like not believing the survivor, not really, we're still very much stuck in this thing that a lot of folks thought was more of an older generation thing of not being willing to know that these stories are true. And I'm continuing to see that in our generation. And so I think for me, it's really this issue of we've become too reliant on people instead of Guru Sahib, right? And if we're all able to build that connection, that direct connection to Guru Sahib, if we're all able to invest in our Gurdwara, invest in building our own relationship, then we can also equally hold each other accountable, because we can get closer to, again, what Paneet Singh mentioned at the beginning, understanding that no one is higher, no one is lower, right? It's not about all of us. I think this conversation also comes up in discussing feminism, right? It's not that, like, women need to be treated like better than men. It's that all of us are on an equal plate, right? We're just fighting for that idea of equity and what we need to do to get to that point of everyone being in that experience of Iqbal God. So I think in terms of tangibles, that's something I'm thinking about, of how do we get rid of this very non-Gurmat ideology of putting one person on a pedestal and saying, okay, Tika, whatever this person said, this is our Baisab. whatever this person says is now my understanding of Sikhi, and whatever they say is true, right? We're no longer at a point of saying Guru Sahib is true. We're saying whatever my Bhai Sahib said is my true understanding of Sikhi. So I think that's something that we really need to very urgently deconstruct in our mentality, that I think is both tied into these issues of sexual violence within the community, is tied into even things like Gurdwara politics, right? It's this idea that we are trusting one particular person to make the decisions of the community. And yeah, when we have processes of like Sarbat Khalsa and other more sovereign measures, why are we really doing that? So.
That's phenomenal. Yeah, an abuse of power comes from having power to abuse. And if we restore that power to the Sangat where Guru Sahib meant for it to be, then we don't need to have like single points of access that can gatekeep Gurbani. Thank you so much for that. Okay, so I'm going to switch over to the Q&A, and we have a couple questions. And I can also see that there's a great conversation happening in the chat. So if you can reframe those in the form of a question, please put some of them over there. So the first question, as we better articulate our own narrative in ways that speak to our next generation of Sikhs, how do we insert these perspectives into the mainstream narrative or larger national and international issues like climate or social justice? And that's Kulveer Singh from Brampton. So I don't know which one of you wants to take this, and I think you can see the question written out too if you need some time to think about it. Paneet Singh, do you want to try?
I think you're muted, or I'm not hearing anything.
I was on mute. I started answering so beautifully. I answered the question perfectly, but the microphone is muted. So I hope what you're saying. I think one thing that we often do is we silo our spaces of conversation into like traditional dharmak and then I don't know, scholarly dharmak or whatever you want to call it. And so like there's lots of siloing in our community. I think a big thing that could help with this is understanding like that we have our greatest points of access to the community are our traditional spaces, are our Gurdwara stages. Now, yes, there's a monopoly on Gurdwara stages by certain people and demographics, right? And that becomes very problematic and very tough. But I think that, I mean, like usually a young Kathawachik, an English-speaking Kathawachik, Toronto-born Kathawachik, usually can be afforded time on stage and like to do Katha. And I think an important thing that we need to start doing, and Sikhs have been doing for centuries, or for decades at least, I can't speak to centuries, is putting our commentary on contemporary social issues and issues of justice now, social justice now, into our traditional discourses. If you go to, I was in Patna Sahib earlier this year, and I was listening to Suraj Prakash Katha in the evening by Jathedar Ranjit Singh, and he was talking about like during Suraj Prakash Katha, he's relating things back to safety during coronavirus, and this was in March, right before like things got locked down. It was very important. So why are we not talking about why are we sweeping under the rug or siloing conversations around climate, social justice, etc., when would like traditional texts speak to it at least a little bit? And so we have those opportunities, and I think that we do have young people who are very interested in upholding these traditions as well, which I think is fantastic. One of my good friends, Gurkirat Singh, was the first time I heard a Kathawachik on stage doing Katha in English and Punjabi talk about indigenous issues back in 2015, I believe it was, 2016, maybe 17. And that was amazing, right? Like, everyone's connecting to that because it's what they're there to absorb. And this commentary from the Kathavachik is something that they're looking for in their lives. So I think we need to stop siloing our spaces so much, because the answer isn't to make really bad kids shows on YouTube. I mean, I feel like that's what we think is like, हाँ बच्चे YouTube देखते हैं, बच्चे हंसते हैं YouTube पे video पढ़ने हैं, right? But like it's someone who really doesn't care about making engaging content, or like even watches YouTube videos themselves. It's like we have these avenues that go right into the arteries of our communities. So let's access those, from me anyway.
That's phenomenal, yes. Harleen, do you want to add anything to that question?
I think I'll just really quickly again emphasize what I shared before. Also, sorry, there's like a very intense thunderstorm starting here, so if there's background noise. I think we need to remind ourselves that, you know, something that I hear often, you know, when we're sort of struggling of how do we do a modern day application of Sikhi, is that there's no precedent for this, or for example, yeah, any of these issues that were listed in the question, like, oh, Guru Sahib didn't address that specifically, which again, I think as Paneet Singh said, is not necessarily the case. But I think that we need to make a little more effort and realize that, okay, maybe if that specific issue we don't feel like is exactly addressed in Gurbani, what is the framework that is being provided to us that we can use to address that issue? So this might be oversimplifying, but I really think that it is this easy, that if we are able to embody the idea of Ikkon God in everything that we do, that really leaves no space for inequality, for oppression of any kind, right? Like how can you see those things as happening in the same space? And so I think for us as Sikhs, you know, these examples that Paneet gave of what sort of issues do we see in the world today, and how do we apply a Gurmat framework to that? And also while doing that, making sure that we're not letting the world dictate our understanding of Gurmat. So I think it has to be a very important process first of understanding Gurbani, building a relationship with Guru Sahib for ourselves, doing our best to start moving away from English translations that are very colonial and patriarchal and all of those things. And through that, as we build that relationship, as we understand Gurbani, as we read Sikh history and start to get even these contemporary examples, as Paneet Singh brought up, we will be able to better build a Gurmat framework that we can then use to approach every single issue. Because yeah, we have coronavirus now, we have climate change now. 100 years from now, Sikhs are going to be dealing with different things, right? So as Sikhs, we have to be more innovative and less lazy. And I say that even to myself, that I think we really have to put in the effort to realize Guru Sahib gave us all the answers. And it's quite simple. It's just that we're not willing to put in the effort to actually apply that in an authentic way.
Okay. For Harleen, we had from Jasveer Basi from LA. When you're referring to Guru Sahib, who are you referring to?
I mean, I think just going off of what I said just now, I think that, you know, we have obviously as Sikhs, we have the embodiment of Guru Sahib in Guru Granth Sahib Ji, and that Gurbani is first and foremost what we should be building a relationship with. Gurbani, I think, is the truest form of Guru Sahib's embodiment and legacy that we should be using as our guide. And then I think we also have the benefit of Sikh history, of Sakhis, to really give us those contextual examples that we need. So again, you know, going back to the previous question, if we feel like we don't fully understand the application of a particular idea, maybe thinking about the Sakhi or the particular anecdote around that Shabad, to give us more context in terms of building that relationship with Guru Sahib. But I think the simplest answer is just Gurbani.
Thank you. Okay, from Harleen Kaur. How do we ensure we don't fall into the trap of thinking that young people are the only and perfect answer? I've heard superb katha in Punjabi, but many youth now don't get it. Many leaders in our generation are perpetuating, but also many leaders in our own generation are perpetuating sexism, racism, etc. How can we make sure our community standards are high when it comes to identifying leaders? Paneet Singh.
I love this question. I love this question also because I love young people. And I don't think that that young people are the only perfect answer. I don't think there ever is an only perfect answer. I think there's only awareness and discomfort. So the reason that I love young people is because I work a lot in education, so I spend a lot of time with them. But I mean, through like my lots of exposure to young people, and my profound amount of exposure to our institutions and our power structures in the Sikh community, I can definitively say one is much more enjoyable to work with than the other. And I'll let you guess which one that is. Seriously, I'm Gen Z Twitter. I'm all about that. So, but there's superb Katham Punjabi and youth. And you don't know it. Okay, so this is I think this for myself. This is a consequence of the fact that we silo our conversations. I did talk in the last answer about bringing our conversations here into traditional spaces, and that's important. I also feel like it's important to get people who have different value systems or mindsets or opinions, even like uncomfortable ones, like really uncomfortable ones, into these spaces and to have these discussions, right? It has to be a two-way avenue. Like that's not a directive for everyone to open up every space to every person all the time, of course, because there are spaces that are dedicated for certain conversations to maintain the integrity and safety of those spaces. But how can we make sure our community standards are high when it comes to identifying leaders? I think Harleen Kaur does an amazing job of reiterating this over and over again, which is why I insist she's a gangster. And that is that why are we so dependent on the leadership of individuals, right? Why are we, when our guru has put so much into Panth, when elevated us into Panth, yes, there will naturally be leadership that emerges. But if I'm determined to spend the rest of my life looking for and cultivating and creating the Sant Jarnail Singh, I'm going to have a really hard time. You know what I'm saying? Because I have perspectives on an individual person that are individual and flawed perspectives. And I'm trying to then force that upon somebody else. I think as a collective, we can raise our consciousness, attach it to Guru Sahib, and use Guru Sahib as our guiding light, as our everything. And I think that's really the only way forward. But yeah, I love Gen Z. I think that's the one thing to take away from that answer.
Agreed. Okay, and so next question from Gurjeet Kaur. This is a little bit leaning more to the Bhakti side. Harleen Kaur, you mentioned about having the experience of Ik Onkar, and I love the way you keep referring back to that. Do you feel this concept is discussed enough or understand, at least at a rudimentary level in Sikh circles? To elaborate, what would you say about the Sikh understanding, practice, conversation regarding the internal experience of Bhakti being what Guru Sahib teaches relative to the external doing of Bani Bhakti? Would love to hear from you both.
I mean, that's really the question, right? Like, I think that's our whole journey as Sikhs. So I will respond to this the best I can, given where I am in my Sikh journey. But I think that, okay, there's a lot of parts here. So I think that in terms of the rudimentary level component, I think what you're getting at, Gurjeet Kaur, is maybe that I think like most of Sikhi, we really undersell it. And I think we don't understand how, the reason to me, I think Bani is so beautiful is because it is so simple and complex at the same time. So I think the concepts that Guru Sahib is giving us are simple in the sense that they are easy to understand theoretically, but putting them into practice is so hard. And I think I was actually thinking about this as Paneet Singh answered the question about, you know, sort of working with people of particular age groups in the Panth. And I actually was doing a Gurbani Vijad with my Sangat yesterday on the shabad, I pulled it up, but the recording I've heard uses Sajjan Mere Rangle Jai Sote Diran as the main line by Rajinder Singh Singapore. And we ended up having this conversation about, when Guru Sahib is talking about the idea of young versus old, is it really about where we are in our life? Or is it perhaps this idea that we can become young again, and the process of that is more our mentality, and that the earlier we are in life, just naturally, and we even hear this from like social psychologists now, but like you just have less worldly attachments, right, when you're born, because, and even in Punjabi, we say, kids are Rab da Roop, right? So this idea that when you're born, you're closer to Vaheguru because you just haven't had the time to really bring on those attachments. And I think that is the idolization of youth that happens a lot in movements, that the younger you are, the less socialized you are into the systems of the world. And so I think in terms of what that means for actually being what Guru Sahib teaches us, and sort of practicing and understanding Ik Onkar, is the challenge of how do we not get too comfortable in our lives. I think this goes back to the diasporic conversation too, that the reality is a lot of Sikhs have been able to find comfort relative to what they had prior to migration. And I think the danger of that comfort is it makes us forget Vaheguru, honestly. Like if you are feeling very comfortable and you don't feel like you have any challenges, there's so many like phrases and colloquial things that talk about this, but it's very easy to forget Vaheguru and forget the need for connecting with Guru Sahib when you don't have those challenges. And I think that's why it's so important for us as Sikhs to have a more global understanding of oppression, of inequality, and all of those things, because we will realize that even if I'm as an individual am not struggling, someone else is. And that should impact me just as much as my own struggle, because to me, that's the practice of Ik Onkar. That's the embodiment of it, is realizing that another person's suffering is just as important as my own or my family members or my friends. And I think that's sort of like where the tie-in to activism and really practicing Bhakti as Shakti comes from, is sort of being rooted enough in our connection to Guru Sahib and our understanding of connecting with Vaheguru through our worldly experience, that we are able to drive all of our actions and interactions in the world through that.
Yeah. Paneet Singh, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, I mean, I don't feel like I can add much to this. There's one thing that comes to mind, that is that someone did talk about recently that we leave a lot of our discussions at Gurmat day camps for kids, and then we kind of just expect them to become Sikhs and move on with their lives, and so we infantilize a lot of our conversations. I mean, I love Gurmat day camps. I go to usually a few a year because, like, again, love the youths. But I think that it's also really important that like these vichars, they continue, and like the questions that Gurjeet Kaur has put forward, much beyond my scope, but it leads me to a conversation that I was once having with Gyani Indrajit Singh from Rakba, who has this way of speaking that disarms you as a listener and just as somebody that is talking to them. And it was a group of us, and they asked us, they're like, "Tusi tarna is duniya to? Like, do you want to be carried across this world ocean? Do you want to swim across? Basically, achieve mukti or salvation." And they asked like 4 or 5 of us that were sitting there, and everyone's like, "Well, yeah, that's kind of why we're doing this." And they're like, "Okay, they're like, "Tika." And they're like, "This is essentially the problem with how we teach Sikhi." And it sounds so much better in Punjabi than it does in English. But they said, "Sade sare khayal taran wale," right? That मैं तरना दुनिया चों. So ਜਦੋਂ ਅਸੀਂ ਬਾਣੀ ਪੜ੍ਹਦੇ ਹਾਂ, ਅਸੀਂ ਸਾਡਾ ਖਿਆਲ ਤਰਨ ਨੂੰ ਹੁੰਦਾ, and that's how we read ਬਾਣੀ. एक अंग आ गया, तर लिया, right? That we're just swimming across the Bani that we're reading. They're like, "Tusi kade ek shabd de vich dub ke kade dekhya?" They're like, "Je tusi is duniya to tarna ta ek shabd de vich dub ke dekho." And I was like, "Oh my God, that's amazing." It's such a beautiful way of putting it. But I mean, these are the conversations that like are taught in this way. I say that I value my upbringing and learning from like Sampradayik Ustads, because this kind of conversation is embedded in those texts. Now, like how someone relates to those texts is obviously going to be different for each person, but for me it's a really important thing, because a lot of this understanding is what is not communicated in circles and like everyday conversation, or kind of like just rudimentary, as you put it, conversations on Sikhi. And I think if we can like infuse that kind of understanding, and I'm not saying it's exclusively Sampradayik standing, I'm saying that's where my connection comes from. But if we can start, I mean, in our own practice, infusing it in our conversations, that it would be incredible. I don't have solutions. I just have musings.
I got chills when you said that. That's so beautiful. And I apologize because we're not going to get a chance to get to everyone's questions, and there were some really great questions in here. But I do want to end with just your personal reflections at the end of all of this. I think after we listen to this webinar, we go back into the world. We're trying to practice what Guru Sahib has not only told us through Bani, but also shown us through lived examples in history. I think in my experience, like the non-Sikh messages we get always say pick a side, be peaceful, be mindful, protest but only nicely, or, you know, like abolish and anarchy, and sometimes those, like, and in Sikhi those things are not mutually exclusive, and they're not one or the other, and our personal and our political are not two separate things, and they're very blurred. And it's really cool, and it's such a huge privilege to be able to walk on a path where the insistence is that those things become blurred. So my last reflection question to both of you is, in your daily practice and in your life, how do you live the balance and the integration of the strength that comes from Shakti and the mindfulness and the intention that comes from Bhakti, and putting those two together? What does that mean for you as you walk away from this today and you continue to live your life on this path? Harleen, Kaur.
Yeah, I really appreciated you ending with this question, just because I think for me, it even made me start thinking about, I think the first time I heard this phrase was from bell hooks, and sort of this idea of, you know, the personal being political, and so that has sort of always driven my relationship to activism. But as I started to think about this more from what would Sikhi say about this, I just started thinking, I was like, okay, what is personal without ego? What is personal without me? And I think in that sense, it would be more so an understanding of our individual journey of experiencing Vaheguru and connecting with such, which happens through like accountability of our actions at Kadam, right? And then on the flip side, what is political in a world where our goal is to actually remain detached from the world? And so I started thinking about that. And I was like, well, I think political, those are the systems that shape our actions and the attachments that we take on in this world. And so we need to have a deep understanding of that in order to challenge them. So I think that's our political, is actually understanding what is the world, what is political. And so I think for me, again, I guess going back to Gurjit Kaur's point, like it really, for me, where I am in my journey right now, all comes back to Ek Onkar. And I think that is a reflection of how hard it is to embody, because to me, I think the greatest threat that oppression poses to Sikhi is that it denies Vaheguru's creation the opportunity to connect with Vaheguru, right? So if we think about it, all of oppression is happening through worldly mechanisms and material things, which is why it's so salient. But the way it's able to do that, as we talked about with like Sikh legacies of colonization, is that it changes your psyche first. the true danger of oppression is that it convinces a person, whether you're oppressed or oppressor, it either convinces you that you are inherently less than or inherently greater than. And both of those polarizations take you further away from Vaheguru. And so I think that if you're still in a place, if I'm still in a place where I truly believe that I'm in any way different than the person next to me, whether it's someone who has greater privileges than me or less privileges than me, how can I truly experience Vaheguru if I'm still seeing myself as different in any way? So I think to me, when I start to rethink about this phrase from a Gurmat perspective, it is, how do I root my personal in something that is not homme? And how do I root my political in something that is to experience Vaheguru during this lifetime? And I think all of that comes back to this like symbiotic process of Bhakti and Shakti, right? Of just how do we practice both of these simultaneously to really root ourselves on that journey to Vaheguru.
Yeah, beautiful. Thank you. And Paneet Singh, final reflection.
Yeah, so it's a great place to end off on, which is, for myself, I've been reflecting the last day or so on Ardas. And because Ardas, I feel like, is this incredible relationship between the personal and the political, and like the divine and the self. And there's, so like when we break it down, first we're acknowledging our gurus, then we're acknowledging our shaheeds and our community, then we're doing ardas for our community and our panth, and then we're doing ardas for ourselves, and our ardas for ourselves ends with an ardas for humanity. And I think this idea of the personal and political being dichotomous is one of those like Western imposed dichotomies that Harleen talked about earlier, because it's like, well, like this idea of politics at the dinner table, but like Maharaj brought politics into the darbar, right? Like, you know, like screw your dinner table, like we're doing this in the darbar, which is incredible to me. And again, like there's differences in opinion and that kind of thing, and there's a lot of discussion now about like, yeah, opinions are fine, but when your opinion becomes a question of my existence or the humanity of another person, then we're gonna have a problem. And I think this has always been at the crux of Sikh practice, of our martial and devotional ethos. So for me, like I reflect on Ardas a lot, and I love hearing Ardas that isn't standardized, or, you know, like sometimes like a sthanak maryada of Ardas, or like someone, because it changes from place to place based on geography, based on the politics of that area, based on the language of that area, which is all incredible to hear. And the thing is, the thing that never changes about Ardas is that structure, is that it goes from Akal Purkh, Guru Sahib, Panth Sardas, My Ardas, Sarbat Tapala. And that will never change, but it'll change as it affects the communities around us. And so that's where my reflection ends today, I think, is kind of absorbing and living presently in those moments of Ardas when we do them, and then applying that lens towards the way we live our life. And on this, the one thing that I had planned to say, this kind of just all came off the cuff, was Sangat itself. The idea of Sangat, not just Panth, but actually going to Sangat, carries the same kind of blur of personal and political. Sangat is the one that carries us across this world ocean. Sangat is the one that Sangat is our family. Sangat is our Raj. Sangat is everything for us in Gurbani. So like in this place where we live on that hyphen of Bhakti and Shakti and Miri and Piri, and I think that hyphen is where things like Ardas and Sangat and all of our radically dope concepts that we have in our devotional practice come from.
Thank you so much. There have been so many moments of, even though I've been muted when you guys are talking, I'm responding. I'm like, wow, yeah. I reimagining how I think about Ardas, and I think how I think about power in Sangat. I think today's conversation is such a great example of leadership and sharing laterally and being immersed in our Guru without any violence. So it's possible. And your conversation is an example of what we're talking about, that Bhakti and that Shakti. Thank you both for tuning in mid-thunderstorm and from a different time zone and amidst all the technological difficulties. I know you both have a lot of projects. A couple that I'm going to share, name drop, just because I enjoy consuming the stuff you produce. Harleen Kaur just published a peer-reviewed journal article, which is a feat if you are in academia, and you can find it in the Amerasia Journal, and it's called Making Citizenship, Becoming Citizens. And Paneet Singh, amongst the many things he does, one of my favorite things is the work with the Nameless Collective and the podcast. What is the name of the podcast? Is it Nameless Collective?
Yep.
Okay. Look it up, listen to it. I've learned so much from it, and so entertaining and engaging. And I learned so much from both of you. Thank you for sharing all of your gifts with all the Sangat that tuned in today and those who will be listening later when this is released as a podcast. And with that, I will turn it back to Manvinder. Waheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Waheguru Ji Ki Fateh.
Beautiful. Amazing. Thank you to all of you. Sincerely, this conversation was so great. I have so much to reflect on for the rest of my Sunday. And thank you again to all the participants for tuning in, for sending in your questions, and apologies to all those questions that were not answered. As always, a recording of this webinar will be available within 24 hours. And please tune in to our next webinar, which is on Wednesday, July 22nd, where Harinder Singh will explore questions such as, what is Miri Piri? Did it start with the sixth sovereign Guru Hargobind Sahib? Are the two swords necessary? Why is there so much importance here in Sikhi? How can it be a lived reality in current times of divided allegiances? You can register at sikri.org/webinar. And lastly, don't forget to tune into the Sikhcast, a podcast produced by Sikhi, where we explore the various issues and events affecting Sikhs worldwide. Thank you for joining in. Today's webinar will be ending now. Vaheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Vaheguru Ji Ki Fateh.